Welcome, everybody. Today, we have two special guests joining us. One from, here in London, and the other from, Bill's in Washington.
Yep.
So, from a foreign country. So our two speakers today are Dr. John Heng and Dr. Bill Sullivan. And Bill Sullivan is now is the Joseph P. Kennedy Senior Chair at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and is a full professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Philosophy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And Bill has a long history of working with people with developmental disabilities. He did his undergraduate studies at McMaster, and then went to medical school at the University of Toronto, and also has a Ph.D. in philosophy, so a lot of education. And Bill was the senior responsible author for the development of guidelines for the primary care of adults with intellectual disability, which has been a really important document in family medicine and for sort of the treatment of people with developmental disabilities. Hey, Bill, how are you?
Great to be here. Thank you.
Giving your praises to everybody. And I think that document has been updated at least once since it was first published, and has really been a seminal, I suppose, in sort of looking at the specialized care that people with developmental disabilities require. And Bill was also featured in the current edition of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario Dialogue magazine. There were actually 3 articles on treatment of medical care of people with intellectual disabilities, and Bill was interviewed prominently in that. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Sullivan with us. Dr. Heng did his undergraduate and graduate studies at the University of Toronto. John added in his bio when he sent it to me that that's where he and his sister met Bill, and so Bill is now married to John's sister. So it's a very close relationship all the way around. There's a lot of moving parts, I guess. John is now the chair of the Department of Philosophy at King's College, and also has an appointment in the Department of Disability Studies and Thanatology. However, I think really what John is probably best known for is for writing what has been described to me as perhaps the best high school valedictory address that some people have ever seen. John had the fortune to go to St. Michael's College School and was a year ahead of myself in school. But I think that, well, not that anybody cares at this point in time, but he wrote a remarkably good valedictory address. But anyway, today, John and Bill are going to be talking about disabilities and climate change and ethics of that. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Rob. Bill and I are just very happy for this opportunity to share with you some ideas that we've been thinking about. We're still in the very beginning stages of our work on some of these issues. So definitely we're looking forward to the end of our discussion, where we will have an opportunity for questions and feedback from you, because there's lots to discuss and lots that we can learn from. So to begin, just a note that we'll be using the term intellectual and developmental disabilities rather than the more common term developmental disabilities in Ontario. Sometimes we'll abbreviate it as IDD. So this is the set of issues that we're talking about today are fairly, well, I guess ecology, I think, is very much present in the media these days, and certainly on everybody's minds. But when talking about these kinds of issues within healthcare itself, and specifically in relation to healthcare of people with IDD, I think it's something fairly new. So there's lots of research that needs to be done, lots of reflection, I think. And what Bill and I are trying to do today is try and open up a conversation for that to happen. So essentially, we're going to be talking about how we've come to a new understanding, an ecological understanding of what disability is, that has informed some of the research that we've done on in various areas, and how that has also opened up now new possibilities for investigation in the future. And our hope ultimately is to encourage all of us to support people with IDD and their families to be agents of change, maybe even leaders of change, for the changes that are necessary, not only in response to our climate crisis, but also to the structures, systems, and delivery of healthcare that we know, being in the field, definitely do need changes in order to support people with IDD and the families well. So I'll start by a couple of disclosures. Essentially, no potential conflicts of interest that I can think of or Bill can think of. We are going to be referring to what Rob mentioned a moment ago, the Canadian guidelines for the primary care of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we'll also be using other peer-reviewed publications. Okay, I'm trying to advance my slide. There we are. These objectives you've seen in the flyer that was pre-circulated. I won't read them. I've highlighted some key terms that we'll be focusing on. I will essentially be walking you through the first two of those objectives. Bill will be talking about objectives 3 and 4, and then we'll come back at the end with a couple of very brief cases to help us apply what we've learned and to situate them in very concrete clinical situations. And then, of course, as I said, we're looking forward to the discussion at the end. So, understanding disability. So I've been asked to start with some reflections on understanding disability. And I think most of this will be material that you will be familiar with. I think that the oldest model of disability is what we in disability studies call the individual model. Sometimes the derogatory term is the medical model. But essentially, this is the idea that the impairments or the deficits of an individual are that person's disability. And that the role of healthcare simply is to fix, and if not to fix, then to prevent or manage that impairment. Beginning in the 1960s, of course, there was a new model that was developed, and one can date the birth of disability studies to the emergence of this model, the societal model, or what could simply be called a social model. And here there's a distinction being made between the impairments that someone has and that person's disability. So that an impairment is not necessarily seen to be disabling. What is disabling is the lack of social supports, accommodations for that individual. So a quite common example might be someone with reduced mobility. And that condition in itself is not disabling unless society lacks the structures and systems to accommodate that reduced mobility. So, for example, having accessible sidewalks and entrances and so forth. And nowadays, I think there's widespread recognition, even within disability studies, that really it's a combination of individual factors and societal factors, that disability doesn't reside just in individuals or in society or social factors, but reside somewhere in the interaction between these two. More recently, I think in the 1990s, we've seen the emergence of another model of disability, the variation model, which is really the idea that all of us are disabled in some way. There's a spectrum of disabilities. We situate ourselves somewhere along that spectrum. And those of us who support people with IDD, particularly those of us who support people with autism spectrum disorder, are quite familiar now with the term neurodiversity. And that comes out of that variation model. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about an ecological model of disability, which in some ways integrates insights of each of the previously mentioned models, but also goes beyond to address some of the deficiencies of each of those individual models. And it builds upon a lot of work that has been done in the field of IDD, particularly the work done in terms of defining IDD, not simply in terms of intellectual and cognitive impairments, but also in terms of adaptive functioning. The work done on the level of the World Health Organization in terms of understanding what function and disability could mean, and also drawing in the insights from fields as diverse as philosophy, engineering, and environmental sciences. And this really is focused on the idea of complex adaptive ecosystems. And there are three main characteristics of complex adaptive ecosystems. So we're trying to think of disability or people with disabilities, or more specifically, people experiencing disabilities, as being embedded in these complex adaptive ecosystems, which exhibit these characteristics. The first is that of interdependence and co-agency. So an ecosystem has many different parts, many different components and relationships, all of which are interdependent. These ecosystems are complex, so again, multiple parts, diverse. The interaction among these various parts give rise to new properties, new states of organization that emerge over time. And these ecosystems are adaptive. In other words, they respond to inputs from the outside, perturbations, in a way that is potentially resilient. So those three key ideas of interdependency, emergent properties over time, and potential resilience or adaptivity, then lead us to kind of formulate an understanding of disability not as something static, so not as something that somebody has, but really it's a response to change. So disability is change that causes this harmony in complex adaptive ecosystems in which persons are embedded, which call for adaptive responses. And these adaptive responses are either promoting capabilities or protecting against vulnerabilities. So that's a whole lot that I've thrown at you in terms of a kind of a reconceptualizing of disability. The main point here is to think of disability dynamically, to think of disability in terms of whole systems, and to think of disability in terms of adaptive responses to perturbations. So just on that last point of adaptation and resilience. So resilience is really the ability to adapt to internal and external perturbations that will enable developing, maintaining, and restoring states of harmony or healthy equilibria in the ecosystems in which persons are embedded. And these adaptive responses can happen on various levels. So this is where we build in and integrate the various models, the individual, societal, and ecological models of disability. So on the level of the individual in healthcare, we certainly encourage a move away from the deficits model of disability and to think in healthcare about how on the individual level to promote resilience and adaptability, you can begin by promoting health habits and coping skills and promote decision-making and advanced planning capabilities of individuals. On a societal level, it's about building relationships, of adjusting clinical and public health care measures, and involving persons in contingency planning, in adapting to future changes to ecosystems. And on the ecological whole-scale level, we can look at reducing environmental harms, finding sustainable alternatives, and promoting ecological awareness, engagement, and even leadership. And this third point, how to increase and promote and enhance ecological resilience, is primarily what Bill will be talking about today. So just very briefly, how this new way of understanding disability has informed the past research that Bill and I have been engaged in with other colleagues around the world. We haven't, and I guess we haven't explicitly, I guess, published in this area of defining disability in ecological terms, but a lot of the concepts that I've just been explaining has been implicit in a lot of the work that we've been doing so far. So we've been doing some work, for example, on supported decision-making and trying to understand that ecologically. Now, supported decision-making is something that is gaining attention within the field of IDD. But we find that sometimes there are different understandings of what supported decision-making is. One quite common understanding, I think, and one that I think underlies a lot of the work done on the level of the United Nations, is one which looks at the family of friends, decision supporters, as being on the outside of individuals, providing support in the sense of increasing the capability of individuals to exercise their autonomy. And that model of supported decision-making, I think, has its merits. But what Bill and I and Michael Bach and others have been kind of trying to do is to think about supported decision-making in a more relational and a more ecological context, where the decision-making is not, or shall I say, the authority of decisions is not invested in individuals, but more in the quality and reciprocity of the relationships between supporters and individuals. We can speak a little bit more about this in the discussion period, but that's just to briefly illustrate for you how ecological thinking has informed our understanding of supported decision-making. And also, recently, Bill and some colleagues in England and Sweden have been working on, reflecting on responses to COVID and trying to think of ethical frameworks to prevent some of the what we saw as inadequate responses to the needs of people with IDD during the pandemic were. And again, a lot of that was informed by ecological thinking and thinking of disability within the context of complex adaptive ecosystems. To realize that responses to pandemic can't simply be single fixes So for example, prevention of disease, but must look at the whole kind of ecosystem within which people with IDD and their family and other caregivers are embedded. Again, if you'd like more comment on that, we can talk about that during the discussion. And finally, I guess Rob mentioned the guidelines on primary care of people with IDD. There have been three versions of three updates. The first in 2011 was the original set of guidelines. Then I guess 2009, then 2011, and then 2018. And with each revision, we also fine-tune not just the content, but also the methodology of those guidelines. And we collaborated with some Australian colleagues, Salvador Carula and Luker Smith at the University of Sydney at the time, and asked ourselves, what are the implications of thinking of disability as in terms of a complex adaptive ecosystem for the development of guidelines in the care of people with IDD. And one of the important kind of implications was that we realized that the traditional way of developing guidelines based on evidence-based medicine, which is the traditional kind of pyramid or hierarchical rating or ranking of evidence that you see represented in the diagram here, from systematic reviews to randomized controlled trials and so on, didn't meet the needs of people with IDD. It didn't take into account their embeddedness within complex adaptive ecosystems. So for the 2018 guidelines, we expanded the evidential base for these guideline recommendations to include the traditional kinds of studies, the empirical or experimental studies, but also incorporating observational and contextual. So these are studies on the systems of care within which people with IDD and their families are embedded, incorporating expert knowledge and experiential knowledge, so recognizing the co-agency of both healthcare providers and of patients and their caregivers in generating knowledge as they adapt to health situations that are changing. So that's just kind of a very quick overview of how we got to our 2018 guidelines and the tools which help with the implementation of those guidelines in the specific local ecosystems of individuals with IDD. So a little bit now on if we were to update our guidelines in 5 years, what would we do? And I think in our current context, we need to think a lot more about what people are starting to refer to as the environmental or the ecological determinants of health. So we're all very familiar with the social determinants of health, but this idea of ecological and environmental determinants of health is something very new. And of course, the social and the ecological interact. But by ecological determinants or contributors of health, we mean those natural resources and processes that are essential to support the life and well-functioning of humans and other organisms. So here are a few of these determinants. I won't go through each item on that list, but that's just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about ecological determinants of health. We're very much influenced by the World Health Organization's One Health idea. And this idea that it's not only human health that we're talking about, but also the health of animals and plants, and of course, the harmony and integrity of the environments, the physical environments, which we all share, so that to promote the capabilities and to protect the vulnerabilities of one is to protect to promote the capabilities and protect the vulnerabilities of all. So this leads us then to the second point that we hope to make, which really is focusing on this notion of environmental pollution and the etiology of IDD. This is not news, I'm sure, to many of you, and certainly particularly in relation to autism spectrum disorders, that there's great concern, I guess, about the link between environmental toxicants and the etiology of autism. But just a note on terminology. Of course, there are toxins that are naturally occurring in the environment, in nature. So, for example, the heavy metals, arsenic, lead, and mercury. But industrialization has created increased, I guess, levels of these naturally occurring substances and created new ones. So you see a list of certain toxicants that have been identified as being of concern for their neurotoxicity. And the ones that I've highlighted were mentioned in this article, the reference of which you see at the bottom of this slide. They are the ones that I think most research has been done on in terms of their neurotoxic effects. And Gaylord and her colleagues estimate that between those years of 2001 to 2016, that there are likely 1.2 million children in the United States that were born with a neurodevelopmental disorder linked to either prenatal or early life exposure to these four substances alone. The worrisome thing, of course, is that, as this article points out, of more than 80,000 registered chemicals with the EPA in the US, only about 200 of those have been specifically tested and extensively tested for neurotoxicity. And many of those not tested are known to interact with one or more genes that are related to autism. It's estimated, and this is already an estimate that is 10 years old, that between 400,000 to 600,000 people in the US per year may have a IDD as a result of in utero exposures to one or more toxic chemicals. And obviously, there's a lot that we don't know about these causality, correlation. A lot depends on level and time of exposure, complex genetic and epigenetic interactions with these toxins. We don't know a whole lot about the pathways by which toxicity occurs. There's some speculation about its effects on the body's ability to detoxify, the ability of the body to absorb calcium, which leads perhaps to hyperconnectivity of neuronal neuronal activity, and the development of neurons themselves, genetic mutations, and so forth. We don't know a whole lot about the pathways of toxicity, and much more research needs to be done. Obviously, we don't have those direct one-to-one causality links, except maybe for certain substances like lead to the development of neurodevelopmental disorders. And there's some research also being done on how to mitigate the effects of that toxicity. So folic acid supplementation during pregnancy appears to be neuroprotective, according to some studies. I'll turn it over now to Bill.
Okay, thank you, John. So I'm going to go fairly quickly on the next couple sections. And what we're kind of talking about now is this shifting from specific pollutants and toxins and their effects on people with IDD to this broader notion of climate change, and to think about that in terms of the health of people with IDD. So this is actually just to flag what is sort of meant by that, sort of referring to the magnitude, frequency, duration of adverse weather events that are happening globally. And I just listed there, some of these things, beginning with rising temperature and humidity, these heat waves, more extreme weather events, rising sea levels, so loss of arable land and flooding, the CO2 level story, and acidification of oceans and other aquatic systems. And then this complex synergistic interactions among these different things that are changing. And one of the points here that's being discussed is the tipping point. So I guess one of the things that this tries to highlight is that at some point, it's going to be the feather that breaks the camel's back. At some point, these adaptive ecosystems are adapting, but they have limits. And the big question is, well, what is the limit, and can we predict it? And of course, a lot of the global strategizing about addressing this global problem is based on assumptions about what that tipping point might be. And some have, kind of thought that, and this is actually this intergovernmental panel on climate change 20 years ago, they thought it could occur if global warming reached 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial age temperatures. So more recently, the same group is saying, well, we might have been wrong. It might be between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius. And currently, we are at 1.1 degree. And so one of the things that this is flagging is that at some point, there's going to be this cascade effect of things happening, like melting of Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, which is going to affect ocean current systems, and then deforestation of Amazon and other rainforests, et cetera. So you can see that this is sort of a concern when this might happen. So next, John. So this is actually, I'm just going to show a couple images of how different groups have tried to kind of in a diagram format indicate these complex relationships between what in the inner circle of this diagram is about the carbon dioxide story, and then you go around that inner circle to these other effects and then the outer circle are further effects, and then on the outside are human health repercussions. And I think just to highlight this kind of alarming claim that was made by Costello and colleagues in the Lancet back in 2009, so quite a while ago, that this is the biggest global health threat of the century. And I don't hear people contradicting that. In fact, I hear people comparing this to COVID and saying that COVID is peanuts. You know, it's a blip in time, it's over with. This is only going to get worse. And so anyway, I don't want to be alarmist, but part of the reason why we're thinking about this is that there's not a lot of talk about it in healthcare, I find. So it is, especially when we're thinking about people with intellectual disabilities, worth beginning to talk and think about this. So one of the effects that this will have on people's health is, in the first instance, exacerbating chronic conditions or existing health conditions, comorbidities or multimorbidities. And we'll show that in one of our cases. The other thing, of course, with temperature change, increased prevalence of vector-borne diseases. They're talking about malaria moving further north geographically, and pandemics, and then also disrupting our systems, particularly healthcare systems. So I just wanted to also flag that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are kind of doubly disadvantaged. And one is that they already have a high prevalence of the sort of comorbidities that are listed here. And we've highlighted those in the guidelines. And so they're going to be vulnerable just on the biological level. But in addition to that, they, as a group, require some kind of responses by healthcare providers that are able to understand and respond appropriately to their needs. And when these things are happening, they may well have less access than they do now to such care. And so it raises kind of concerns about equity and about the capacity of public health systems to actually adjust so that they can support people with such disabilities. And by the way, no studies have been done about this particular group and the effects of climate change on their health. Next. So this is another image that also tries to indicate some of these complex links between systems. And this is also something from Watts and colleagues and the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change report. And it basically is trying to show not only the direct effects of climate change and the kind of pathways of those, but also these indirect effects that are complex, interrelated pathways that show this influence between and among climate, ecosystem changes, say effects on habitats, and health equity, so non-climate related social mediating factors. And so the list on the left is sort of what is commonly referred to as social determinants of health. But you can see all these other things are actually connected in a fundamental way to those. So next. So the other issue is the effect. When we talk about health, we are always thinking health and well-being, and that includes mental health. And so it's we know about people with intellectual disabilities having often vulnerability in this area in relation to past trauma that we're, I think, beginning to be much more attentive to. And that these things, even the thought of these things, may well be traumatizing. They may feel unsafe as a result of this. And so this will have a concerning impact on them. And just on a positive note, there is this sort of talk about resilience and helping people to be resilient, and the research showing the positive effect of access to green spaces for people with IDD. And again, the final note is that research involving people with IDD is very limited, and is another sort of inequity that needs to be addressed. So the next. So just to sort of, I say, speak about the elephant in the room here. And I think that this might even be a reason why in healthcare, we're a little bit reluctant to talk too much about this issue, because of the fact that healthcare industry itself is a pretty big contributor to the problem. And that is a kind of an ethical issue. What is our goal in healthcare? And have we been just unconscious that health is actually dependent on ecological health? Human health is connected to that. And that should we not even think about the impacts that our efforts to help human health are having on this what they say is the biggest issue of the century. So there's lots that's been said about that. I think one thing that kind of is memorable is if healthcare sector were a country, and I believe this is the US, but it would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet. So healthcare itself has a big footprint. And some of this is from a group that talks about healthcare without harm. So next. And so just breaking that down a little bit, and this will be sort of my last kind of stab at this issue. But of all the different sources of negative contributions to climate from healthcare, 71% is actually related to the supply chain. So it's basically not happening where healthcare necessarily is taking place. Some is happening there, but it's this supply chain, what's coming in and what's going out. That's the biggest contribution. Now, the other thing that is a little bit countercultural, I will say, is that it is tied with increased spending. And all governments seem to be clamoring to say, or a lot of what we hear is, we need to spend more. Well, that is actually just that there is this sort of ecological consideration for the economic considerations. And someone that I appreciate very much, who thinks about ethics, says you can't really talk about ethics without talking about economics. So there is something about consumerism and something about accepting that there are limits. And then the other thing that is kind of almost the last point, that there is this cycle that as the climate gets worse, the healthcare needs will go up. And so it is almost a conflict of interest that healthcare is in from a business point of view solely. That, if you want to increase business, then, don't be too worried about the climate. Now, of course, nobody would say that, but that's in fact a bit of a conflict of ends of healthcare itself. Next. So at a kind of a level of just kind of clinical practice. And I must say, it's something that I had not thought about before getting involved in this, is that whenever something is being proposed in healthcare, should we raise the question and actually know something about the ecological benefits and costs, and that become a factor in decision making. And then the other point is that for people with IDD, they need to learn about this stuff as well. And so it requires communicating this in a way that would help them to, understand this side of things, and also supporting their decision making. And so this last slide really is just to highlight some research that's been done on these extreme weather events on people with disabilities and chronic conditions. So it's kind of a pretty broad group of people, but out of that, they did come up with some good, I think, recommendations that are helpful. And I think I would summarize them all as sort of what all Boy Scouts know: be prepared. And I must say that I've just been teaching medical students at an Ivy League senior medical students at an Ivy League medical school. They haven't talked about this at all. I mean, this is all new to them. So they're not, if they don't know, they're not going to be able to help other people to be prepared. And so I think that this is basically just a call to action on this pretty big issue, and particularly on the disproportionate impact it will have on people with IDD. So next. So
Phil and I have prepared some cases, but I think in the interest of time, to allow time for questions and discussions, we will skip those cases. We were trying to really bring out some stories to make more concrete in the clinical setting the implications of what we've been talking about. But I know Bill has to leave for another meeting right at 5 o'clock. So instead, maybe I'll just skip quickly to the key takeaway messages that hopefully we can begin thinking and discussing about. To think about disability in terms of adapting to changes to a complex adaptive ecosystem. That will help us to think of healthcare really that supports the people more holistically. And that it is our hope that people with IDD can be co-agents and be leaders of change for sustainable healthcare. But it all depends on education and providing education that is adapted to their understanding and needs. So, questions, comments? We'd be very happy to receive those.
Bill and John, thank you. That was a fantastic talk, and really thought-provoking, and sort of makes, well, for myself anyways, just think outside the box, right? I mean, it's not standard, straightforward medical stuff, but really not, but very important to think about as we go on. So Jackie Ogilvy is a pediatrician, developmental pediatrician here in London, and a few years ago at our research day, a student working with Jackie had actually done some work looking at this question. I'm not sure, I can't remember whether it was a review or what, but Jackie, do you want to, if you have some comments, I will allow you to talk. If you want to, if you have any questions or comments, Jackie, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Rob. And thank you for the talk. I really, it wasn't something that was on my radar as much either, but I was contacted by Dr. Anna Guns, who's one of our PCCU attendings, and she'd been talking to some families of children with complex medical issues and developmental disabilities. So we kind of put our heads together and did a mixed method study where I kind of drove the qualitative side and interviewed families from both rural and remote fly-in communities about climate extremes and their health and concerns for their children. And it was, I think the lessons learned from some of these families were pretty eye-opening in terms of the preparedness that they have. And that interestingly, some of them talked about it not being overly new, that it is something of being a child with, obviously it was layered on to their intellectual disability as well as having medical complexity or medical fragility, that's something that they've become attuned to as a parent of a child with that level of care, but that these environmental and health extremes had added another layer of needing to be prepared. And they talked about it, well, we map on and we're prepared for the viral season, but now we're prepared for the weather extremes and the heat, and lessons learned around exposure, and even some families driving 1 to 2 hours away to find a playground or a place adapted playground that had shade or something, access the equipment they needed for their child. So I think it had so many different themes, and I'm really glad that you're also kind of bringing this to this population as well, because there's more that we need to learn from the families who are living it and adapting to and being resourceful. We had one family adapt an old canoe for the snowstorms they were experiencing so that their child could still get outside with the other kids. It was pretty fascinating.
Well, thank you for that, Jackie. And I think it's a very important point that you're making, that when we think about these issues, we don't look at disability simply as a deficit, but also strengths, because as you say, many of these families have been living these, with these chronic conditions, learning how to adapt, and there's a lot that we certainly can learn from them. And I think that the other thing that I would say too is that knowledge is important, but it also needs to feed upwards to the public health policy making level as well. And that sometimes that communication or connectivity doesn't happen within our ecosystems of care.
John, I'll just make one comment about that. So the pediatric kind of context is interesting because, as you say, it's families that are thinking about these things. One of the cases that we had, which I shared with the medical students, was about a young adult, so a woman in her early 20s who has asthma, and she presents essentially with symptoms of heat stroke during a heat wave. And one of the things that was a little bit interesting was, in the discussion, was that nobody actually asked, did anybody ever explain to her the risks of heat and humidity? So the case also is also complicated by the fact that she was on an inhaler and her asthma had flared up, and the inhaler, in fact, was ecologically problematic, which one it was. But anyway, even there, the discussion about, well, we kind of address that in the midst of this crisis? Because, she's, by using this, is contributing to this problem. Again, it's all these things are kind of connected, and looking at the issues in the pediatric world is important. They change once people who are pretty independent are on their own and don't have much family support, and so who's actually helping them to be prepared and able to address their needs when they run into problems. And as John said, is this on the radar screen of our public health planning at all? Anyway, I have to excuse myself to go to another meeting, but I'll leave things in John's capable hands. So thank you very much for inviting me to.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay.
Good to see you.
Bye now.
Yep.
Bye.
Jackie, you had a follow-up comment, I think. So if you want to unmute yourself.
I did. Thanks,
Okay,
John.
yep.
And your point is really well taken. And I think that's where Anna and I are looking to even take some of this information and not wait for a big evidence base to grow, because I think there's some time to make change sooner rather than later. And when you say about, moving it upstream, I think about the school boards. So I'm thinking about trying to really make some of those changes at that level, because it's where those kids, and of course I'm speaking about children with developmental disabilities, where they spend so much of their time. And so we definitely learned about how much school children were missing because of extreme heat and schools not being equipped with air conditioners, for example. And so I think that's the place where I would really if you have any tips or suggestions on how to move it up there, we're all ears.
Well, that's excellent. I think we also can learn a lot of things from the COVID situation, as how to move from the knowledge base of individuals and their families to systems and public health policy. And the problem also is that there aren't materials out there adapted to people with intellectual disabilities on these kinds of issues. So I see a great need to begin developing those kinds of literature or other alternative means of communication, the way we have now started to do with various health issues.
But Jackie, I think the point you made was really good. It really made me think, because I don't know what elementary school you went to, John, but I went to OLPH, and it's the whole yard was tarmac, and there was literally no shade anywhere. And I think that and talking to people whose kids go there now, I don't know that it's changed all that much. And to Jackie's point about people with any kind of disability or sensitivity to things, being on black cement all day when you're outside with no shade anywhere is a great way to create problems, I think, if you really want to. It's a bit absurd nowadays, but it's those kind of things. But I think Jackie has a great idea. How would you actually go about lobbying school boards or talking to school board people? Because I think it's a great idea. It's just a matter of what are the logistics of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let me just see if I can unmute Jackie, and then we'll come to you, Ben.
Me first?
Yep.
I was going to ask you guys. I mean, in my day-to-day practice, I've done it patient by patient. So we certainly know some epilepsy syndromes where heat can increase seizures. And so it's writing letters. I now have a templated letter that I've used probably about for 4 or 5 patients now due to different health concerns, ranging from respiratory and tying it to their need to be in school and not wanting to increase inequities around access to learning because of those other exclusions. So that's been a one-off, but I've been trying to rope another student in to take it on as an advocacy project here locally to build some connections with the board to just talk about it more broadly in the sense of, universal design. So it's not the child has a air conditioner and it travels with the child throughout their educations, but we're looking at it more broadly and getting it on their radar.
Yeah, and professional development days are good opportunities to somehow be invited to address that issue.
Dr. Goldberg, you had a comment. I think your hand was up. So I have, if you want to unmute yourself, Ben, and go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me
Yep.
okay? Let's check one of these things. Yeah. Well, first of all, I've got to get rid of the sound now. Okay, can you hear me out now?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You're good to go. You're good to go, Dr. Goldberg.
Sorry?
We can hear you beautifully. You're good to go.
Very good. Okay, first, I'd like to congratulate both Rob and Sarah for choosing a topic about systems beyond the individual system. I want to give 2 examples of a societal system. I was fortunate many, many years ago to act as a consultant for the vocational rehabilitation branch of the United Nations. They sent me to a middle South American country that had been taken over by a military junta. Before I went, I took a look at what is the funding throughout the world for the mentally handicapped. Well, the top funding for all handicaps are usually in the physical range, physical rehabilitation, art, that type of thing. Mental illness, mental health, mental development are at the very bottom end. So I went to this Central American country, and the only thing that sort of was helpful, there was a very wealthy, very influential couple who had a mentally handicapped child. And it was because of them that they were able to influence the United Nations for sending first a consultant and also to increase the funding. So the society as a whole really puts mental handicap at the very bottom in terms of funding. So that's the one comment. So if there's climate change, the societies that are at the bottom end are going to be worst off. The other, in terms of environmental pollution, we had a situation at CPRI where a child was brought in from a Caribbean country, and the pediatrician who was assigned found that she had lead poisoning, but then she was also eating the chips off the paint at CPRI. And so fortunately we had a group of chemists who were able to chelate her, but we weren't able to discharge that youngster because of the mother and that type of thing. We finally had to go to court. And when we went to court, it was revealed that the pediatrician we found had left out a letter that the mother had sent. This child was eating the sludge from the exhaust pipes of cars in the central company. So we fortunately were able to get a justice to be able to allow us to discharge the child. But I think the whole point about this, very important to take a look at whole systems, and important for developmental pediatricians and psychiatrists to work closely with family physicians. That's my sermon for today.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Goldberg. You made two very important points there. But just to add on to your last story there, I think it's important in those situations to look at interventions holistically, because I guess, emergency care for acute lead poisoning, so forth. I guess, but there are a whole range of related issues too. So why is the pica kind of behavior happening? What is that a response to in that child's environment? And the social issues of the relationship between child and mother, and the financial capability, because really to remove a child or to reduce exposure of that child to lead in the environment may require environmental modifications, may even require new accommodations that families can't afford. And in that case, how available are there systems of social support to address that issue? Unfortunately, by the time chronic lead poisoning has been kind of identified, it's the effects on child development are well underway, and that's part of the tragedy too about that story.
But at the same time, John, I think it is somewhat hopeful, because with a clear public health sort of campaign, I don't think I've ever seen anybody with a high lead level, and I expect I never will. And so it's been sort of stamped out. And so it says that we can make changes. It's a matter of sort of how we organize that. And I think to Jackie's point, I think talking with the school board or schools individually is great, but I think to make change, you probably have to have some kind of advocacy group on board as well, to sort of be the standard bearers or something like that, to make it sort of more appealing at some level, I suppose, or more pressing for people.
No, that's right. I think advocacy does work to some extent, and we know that a number of substances, chemical substances and fire retardants, for example, have now been banned in the US and Canada as a result of advocacy campaigns, but so much more needs to be done.
And I think, John, I was also going to say, I think Bill's point at the early on was really important too, because there is there's a woman at MIT. I can't think, off the top of my head, I can't think of her name, but she is really big on sort of the issue of organophosphates and what their implications are going to be. But she also thinks that the rise in autism correlates almost perfectly with the rise of organophosphates. And so she believes that organophosphates are the cause of autism, and predicts that if the rise continues, that the rate of autism will be 1 in 1 in the near future. And so I think we have to be sort of, it's obviously a multifactorial kind of thing. And we don't want to become too hysterical about it, although we have to recognize issues. John, how did you and Bill become interested in this area, do you think?
Well, originally we were working on the problem of sustainable healthcare. Then we began to kind of make connections with our other research in the area of intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Which, I mean, it's great because, you know, just even think when you talk about sustainable and what Bill was saying about hospitals being a significant contributor to carbon footprints, I'm not 100% sure I'm correct in this, but what I've been told is that LHSC doesn't do a lot of recycling of cardboard boxes and stuff because larger corporations have to actually pay for recycling. And so I've been told by people actually not to bother recycling boxes sometimes at the hospital because it's not going to go anywhere, which
Right.
if that's correct is incredibly disappointing to hear.
Yeah, I think that we have to examine, some of our supposed solutions to the problem. But the main issue, if you were thinking of a slide that where Bill kind of broke down the percentages of contribution of different activities to the carbon footprint, the climate footprint, I should say, of hospitals. The major one, about 3/4 of that comes from, not directly from hospitals themselves, but from the food chain, energy sources that are used for transporting material and so forth. And not a whole lot of thought has, in the hospital systems that I've been kind of familiar with, not a lot of the thought has been kind of been given to addressing those concerns. I think people think about recycling, people think about reducing, emissions of one kind or another. People think maybe even of the various medical devices, like the products using anesthetics, and Bill was mentioning, for example, inhalers for asthma. But it's really also the bigger kind of ecosystem costs in terms of getting the supply, producing the supply, disposing of those supplies that we're only now beginning to realize contribute also to the problem of sustainability in healthcare settings. And also the culture, I think, of, when we discuss interventions with patients, the issue of the environmental cost of some of these interventions is rarely raised in a clinical context. And we have to do better, I think, if we want to talk about sustainable healthcare.
All right, other questions or comments for John? I mean, it's a really thought-provoking topic. Would people have other thoughts or comments or questions? Okay, John, thank you. As always, remarkably thought-provoking and a fantastic presentation. I'm really grateful to you and Bill for coming and joining us. And you can count on being asked back in the within the next couple of years to talk again. But thank you very much for this. I really appreciate it a great deal.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you all for joining us today to think about this very important issue.
All right, John, take care of yourself.